Good morning, Survey and Spatial members. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar this Friday morning. Our presentation today is AI in 2025, and our presenter is Morgan Clerkin. Morgan is the current head of AI at KPMG and an all-round AI enthusiast. He brings a balanced view to all things AI, having spent most of his career as the token IT guy and bringing technology success to areas where the tech was not well understood or was outdated. This gives him a unique insight into both how AI works and what parts of it are valuable to businesses and their people. Now, before I hand over to Morgan, just a reminder to everybody online, if you do have any questions at all throughout the presentation, please pop them into the question box and Morgan will answer these between the sections. So yeah, if you can just pop those in, that would be great. And I'll now hand you over to Morgan.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jenny, and thanks everybody for coming along. As she said, if you've got questions as we go, I'll try to section this out and we'll answer questions as I go and as they pop up, but otherwise hoping to leave a bit of time at the end for anything else. So I've come along today to have a chat with you guys just around where AI is ending 2025. As Jenny mentioned, my role as head of AI at KPMG gives me quite an interesting view across all of the AI scope of technology, and it's been an interesting year as far as where we started and how valuable it was to the everyday user, and really where we've ended up at this late point in the year. So I want to talk a bit through around what's happening in the industry, what we've seen coming through in the year, some key highlights for me along the lines of where the technology has come from. And then I want to spend actually most of the time looking at practical things that you as the audience can take away and start using in your own roles. Now, I'm not going to sit here and be disingenuous and claim that as if I know everything about everything that you will do. But what I'll bring is what we've found has been successful for our people at KPMG, and certainly what's been successful for me. And so what I'm hoping is that I can give you some goals, some tips, and some tricks, and some even just things to think about as far as where you can take your own AI journey. So what we'll cover is a bit of a current state, where we've come from both globally and in New Zealand. There's definitely a lot more research out now than there was a couple of years ago. We'll look at some of the hot topics moving into 2026, those things to look out for, those things that are going to shift the dial a little bit or a lot. We'll start looking at where are the actual business benefits coming in, ChatGPT and Copilot and all of those other AI tools, those productivity gains and those very basic use cases are table stakes for most people. So how do you actually take that to the next step without getting too technical, without having to learn vastly new topics? We'll explore some of the practical applications of AI, and I've got my wife, funnily enough, works within the AI space as well, and she's done quite an interesting set of slides, which I really love using, around how to use AI around the house, because she's certainly overhauled the way that our house administration works. And then I'll end on a bit of a thought leadership piece with a bit of a hopefully good takeaway on how to plan and prepare for agentic AI or some of the more high value uses of AI. So the first one I want to look at is where have we come globally this year with AI? And there's a lot of text on the screen, but really what I wanted to highlight for everybody is that the capabilities of all the models that have come out have really started ticking some of the milestones that we all thought AI was going to hit when ChatGPT first came about, right? We started talking about AGI, we started talking about the Turing test, we started talking about that blurred lines between what is very clearly AI generated and what is reality. One of the things I'd encourage you to look at is there's an article that's been done recently around, you may recall the early AI generated video of Will Smith eating spaghetti. There's a comparison now of how far that technology has come and just how real and surreal these things are looking. But really what we've seen is not just in chat, but also in voice, in video, images. What AI's capability has now become so much more valuable across the spectrum, right? And that's not just those basic consumer grade levels. We're also talking about unique and novel protein discoveries in medicine. We're talking about you may know about the Neuralink and a lot of that sort of brain to computer technology as well. That's coming along a long way as a result of this. Apple's releasing new AirPods with live translation, which for me is quite funny, because the first comments that I ever was, when I first heard about this, the first comment I heard was, well, doesn't that make sitting in the nail salon quite an interesting prospect when you can hear what they're saying in the other languages? But then you may also have seen plenty of those AI generated videos propagating throughout your social media feeds. What is real and what is not? And that's a big question going into next year. From a regulatory perspective, the EU AI Act is really starting to ramp up its own enforcement. So from August this year, there were a bunch of new requirements that have come in for AI foundation model providers, the open AIs of the world. And ultimately, there's a really positive view around AI in the business scope. 86% of CEOs are taking that next step to look at how do we implement digital teammates? How do they become, or AI, how does it become part of the workforce going forward? And how do we manage that from a workforce transformation perspective when, on the other side, we also see interesting studies around the impacts on the job market? As far as how that looks in New Zealand for us, there's a couple of key things that sit within my scope of interest. So we run a report here at KPMG called the CEO Outlook. And these are some of the interesting stats that we're finding from New Zealand based on what we see and what our clients are doing. So 87% of AI is being used in some form across businesses. That's a massive uptick from last year. There are a lot of businesses still getting started with getting ChatGPT or OpenAI, Gemini, all those basic models put in place. For KPMG, we look at Copilot and we look at some of those chat-based tools, and they are something we make sure everybody has, because that is going to give them the ability to learn and grow in this space. So you can see there that 90% of those who do put in AI are seeing efficiency gains. There's definite value coming from AI tools, not just because they are AI, but actually because they're putting in features that are meaningful to the everyday person. AI agents, which is, I'll talk about what those are a little bit later on, but those are starting to become more impactful. They are still a buzzword ultimately, though. Those use cases are still being surfaced up, particularly in New Zealand. We are a little bit of a laggard in that space. And then the bottom line impact is an interesting one, because that is a lot lower compared to the rest of those stats that you can see there. Adoption is really high, but that bottom line impact, cost drivers, revenue drivers are still yet to be seen or yet to be tracked. And part of that is a lot of it is because the productivity gains aren't measurable, right? You think about the minutes that you save from summarizing or from getting AI to draft you an email, that time may actually not be recouped. You may go and instead get a coffee and that time saved. You may take the time to have an extra conversation or do a bit of learning on the side. That doesn't necessarily translate to business benefits, right? And that's not a bad thing at all. But overall, people who do get access to AI report being more productive. So there's some quite interesting things to read into there, which again, I won't spend too much time on, because really what I want to do is bring the most tangible takeaway benefit to you guys. Now for KPMG, one of our big things is AI proliferation is absolutely wonderful. We really want it in the hands of our people. We want them to be comfortable using it. We really want AI to be one of those things that we just expect to be there, like a calculator, like the internet. It is for us just another tool. But we really do need to be careful. KPMG is highly regulated, highly risk averse, and I'm sure some of you in the audience will resonate with this. The impact of poorly reviewed or poorly generated AI outputs and the hallucinations that very much do still exist have a potential impact on businesses, have an impact on the brand, and it's still something to really be conscious of and be careful about, right? So Deloitte for us is a big example. They are one of our key competitors, and they had a very big blunder with AI in the market. And look, this is something that can happen to everybody. So we at KPMG, we looked at it and we went, we're not going to sit there and berate them for using AI, because ultimately we could have been in that position ourselves. So there is still very much an element of what we call human in the loop, that idea that humans are still a highly valuable part of this interaction, and that ultimately your professionalism and your professional judgment, your experience doesn't always get disrupted by AI, or certainly doesn't at the moment. And so one of my biggest things that I encourage our staff to do is trust your gut. Most of us in this room, I would expect, have gone through your career quite happily without AI. And so when you see an output, when you see something that doesn't look quite right with an AI output, trust your gut and have a look into it further. That will take you most of the way there. Now, lastly, agentic AI is the next big thing. That's very much the hot topic. It has been throughout 2025. It is a spectrum of capabilities that an AI tool can have, and it's a grossly overused term. So you'll hear it everywhere that you look for AI. If you've got access to Microsoft Copilot, you may have access to Copilot agents. Those are very rudimentary, basic agents. That second box there. That's really where we start making AI more specialized. It's taking your ChatGPT, hooking it up to some of your proprietary knowledge. It's giving it some custom instructions to inform it how it should respond, what its purpose is, and it creates a repeatable experience. Going into most Copilot, ChatGPT or AI interactions, it all depends on the prompt that you put in then and there. Agents take away some of that because you can prime or pre-configure an agent with those instructions. We then move up into the agentic layer, which is really around the level of autonomy, the level of complexity, and ultimately you're looking at this stage at stringing together multiples of those AI agents as well as other manual or automated processes to produce something more end-to-end, an entire workflow, an entire process, heck, an entire role as well, that idea of a digital teammate. And so as you start moving up, AI starts getting more autonomy. It starts being able to make more decisions. It starts being able to do and see and interact with more. And those sort of upper level spaces are places that most businesses are still wrapping their heads around. What does this actually mean? What are the implications ethically from a risk and trusted and responsible AI perspective? How does that actually work? And I think that's still a space that's very much being explored, but it is exciting. And it's certainly something we're looking at here at KPMG. So that's really the current state of the world when it comes to AI. Now, I can't see any questions in the box at this stage, but if you do think of any as we're going through, feel free to throw them in and I'll answer them at the end. What I want to do though is take a step back and go, well, this is all well and good. Some of you will be able to take this away and use it. What I really want to do is go back to actually where are the most usable and useful aspects of AI for us in our workplace day to day. Now, this is going to be different for people who work in an office environment to those who work out in the field, or your work is predominantly out of your car or on a specific device. But what I hope to bring you guys is a sense of AI can be valuable wherever you go, or AI has an opportunity to be built into something valuable wherever you go. So we'll take a step back to basics for a minute, and I want to kind of think about AI, because I think one of the traps we fall into is that generative AI, your ChatGPT, is a silver bullet, and ultimately it isn't. Ultimately, AI, or the value of AI, comes from a lot of different areas, right? So digital enablement is really that first pillar. How good is your data? How integrated and well understood and standardized are the systems that you use and that AI has access to in order to add value? How empowered are your people or yourselves to understand how to use digital technology, how to use AI, how to understand the data that you've got? And ultimately, that is a huge enabler for more powerful, more valuable uses of AI. You can very easily come along to a general AI chat and upload your own data, and that is totally fine. But in order to get access to the data within your systems, to be able to do that on the go, you've certainly got a level of digital enablement to have done before that. Predictive AI sits in the middle as this alternative to generative AI. It's not always about generative AI. Sometimes your traditional machine learning, neural networks, and that more data science focused aspect of AI is actually the right path. And that's a much better approach. If I think about some very light research I've done on the geospatial and survey industry, a lot of the computer vision models and a lot of the image analysis and that type of AI, they are all based on predictive AI. It's all based on reinforced learning from screeds and screeds of examples and a lot of training data. That is definitely a key thing to bear in mind. But that does require having a lot of data, right? And having it in a good format. And then next we get to generative AI, which is really what we're talking about today. And ultimately, all three of them have a place in the business. Now, if we focus on what generative AI can do, again, taking it back to basics, a bit more it does three things really well. If you haven't started with AI or you're still getting used to it, these are the three things to come back to if you're trying to figure out what you can use AI for. Generating more content, going from something small to something much more rounded out, something that's got more to it. Reducing is the opposite, so being able to summarize, being able to take something really large and complex and bring it down to something more reasonable. And then the transform piece is taking one thing to another. So tailoring something for a different audience, translating between two languages, reformatting something in a different style, but while maintaining the same amount of information within it. And then that kind of leads us to what are then some of those use cases? What does it unlock? So there's a lot on here, so I'll leave it up. I know that this is being recorded for you so you can have a look at it later. But if I kind of call out some of those really starter use cases, it's things like sentiment analysis over here on the interaction piece. Being able to take a lot of information about what's been written and condense it down just to its key points. Speech to text and text to speech are really interesting ones for me because I use the dictation functionality of AI quite a lot. It's great for providing context, and I'll get into some of that in a minute, but context is ultimately the way forward with AI. How much context can you provide will ultimately inform the quality of the output. Anomaly detection is quite interesting when working with data. AI is very good at noticing outliers, particularly with the latest models, noticing outliers, noticing things that aren't wrong, and calling those things up. The visual side of things is really interesting as well. Being able to recognize what is in an image and what it means. And if you think about the fact that it's actually only reading pixels within that image, it's actually quite fascinating, right? And ultimately where we land is a bit of a dream state. Now this one I took from the financial industries, but I think it has broader applicability, right? So the dream is to have real-time visibility into not only what your current state is, but actually what to look for going forward. What are the things, the predictive elements of our data? What can we look for going forward? Early identification of risks and things that we need to do, but also recommendations on how to address them, right? Flexible self-service dashboards, all of that is around the data and again, serving up information proactively to you based on what AI knows you're going to want to see. And I'll kind of skip to the one at the bottom, which is ultimately a workforce or a people that are digitally fluent. You're very comfortable working in the space. You know exactly how to interpret the data that's being provided to you because it's being given to you in a meaningful way, right? And so where we kind of land is, let's not forget and lose sight of what generative AI is and what it isn't, and all those other aspects of the AI umbrella that can add value, right? All of these things can be combined together to service those use cases we looked at a bit earlier, and to add value from an AI perspective. Generative AI is one part of the puzzle, but it's easy to lose sight of that when that's all you see. So one of the things I'd encourage is, as you are going forward and looking into what AI can do, looking at those use cases, and you maybe are coming up against some blocks where maybe AI doesn't interpret or give you the right data back, have a think about maybe whether there's a different element of AI that might be more practical. And maybe that is accessible to you, maybe it's not, but it's worth asking that question. Now, before I move on to the next section, I do have a question in the chat. Do you think you can use AI to check other AI, i.e. use Gemini to check ChatGPT, or are they going to generate similar answers? It's a wonderful question, and it is something I do quite a lot. Definitely something that you can do, and there's a couple of answers here. So one could be having one AI model check the output of another, either for truth or hallucinations or whatever else, and that is totally possible. The one of the approaches that you can take to checking for hallucinations is exactly that. Passing an output or some writing through as many different models as you've got access to, and the chance that they'll all miss the hallucination is incredibly low. So that's definitely one application. The other one I do is, if I'm approaching a problem or a situation, I'll actually put the same prompt in all the different AI tools that I've got access to, and I'll take the best of whatever answers I get, because they'll all have a different perspective, a different set of reference sources, and they'll give me some things in a different way, and it gives me choice, right? You can also do it through your own, through a singular AI tool. It's very, I say very well known, but it's definitely true that whenever you come to a new chat, even within the same AI model, you are going to get a different answer even with the same prompt. So trying things a few different times to see if things change is definitely one approach there. All right, so under the practical applications of AI, I want to cover off a really key point going into when you think about next year. Prompting is an incredibly important skill to have, but what it means in the context of AI is changing. 18 months ago, 2 years ago, prompting was the one and only way that you could get really good outputs out of AI, because you had to give it so much more guidance and instruction around how to do what you wanted it to do. And so, but where it's changing is that these models are now much better at understanding the nuance in behind what you're asking it to do. It has more context, it knows more about you. It knows, just based on that culmination of feedback over the past couple of years around AI, what it means when you ask it to do something that it never had when it first came out. But ultimately, the way I think about it, and the way I encourage you to think about it as well, is think about the instructions that you provide AI being the same as the instructions you might give a colleague or someone around you when you want them to do something for you, right? How much instruction do you give them? But also think about how much you assume. Do you assume that they have all of this experience, that they've done this work before, so they know what you're going to ask? Do you assume things about their values and their morals, about how they might approach a situation? And how much of that is applicable to an AI model? And I've got a slide here I want to show, mostly for effect, but I think it underpins quite an important point, is managing the outputs of AI, particularly as it becomes smarter, becomes very similar to managing the expectations when you give a task to somebody else. And I like that phrase because it starts a conversation more so than being true. But the phrase, you're bad at using AI because you're bad at managing people, it's something to think about, right? How much context are you providing? Because context remains king. An example I use of that is a cup of coffee, generating an image. So the prompt you see there, a cup of coffee, gives me something reasonably generic, still usable in a lot of scenarios, but ultimately not potentially something as useful as this one. And this one here has a much longer prompt, more nuance and more detail, and it gets me closer to potentially something that I do want. Both are valuable. One assumes a lot of information, a lot about what you want it to produce, whereas one makes it very clear and might get closer to what you're after. Now, we at KPMG use Microsoft Copilot, and so we have quite a nice prompting structure. I'm not going to spend too much time here because I think we all sort of have a sense of what that might look like. But ultimately, you can break a prompt down into a goal that you want, which is generally what you want the output to look like. The context, this is the most important part of all of this. How much information can you provide around the reason why you're doing this? The source information is any additional information that will help inform the output, and that's also quite an important piece. And then the expectations are the little nuances around the tone, the audience, and the structure. All right, now the key part I want to spend the time on here is the features, and I'm going to drop out of this presentation shortly and run through a few demos. Ultimately, GPT-5 and that suite of models has been the most important unlock for most business professionals this year, purely because of it is a more general purpose model, and it doesn't require you to think about, am I using one model or another? And it opens up a whole lot of extra features and its ability to use and tap on different tools. So GPT-5 allows it to not only provide you a quick answer if it's a basic question, but to actually think and reason over your request if it is something more complicated. Now, you think about the times that you've come along and thought, actually, that's a really shallow answer, or that's not correct. GPT-5 helps to work around that because it's able to identify something complex and say, actually, I need to plan before I can produce an output. And you can see that in action, and I'll show you that shortly. It's able to take more data. It uses fewer emojis, which as a business professional for me is wonderful. And it's also able to work better with data because it is able to write code or create its own tools in order to perform a function. So you think about how often, if you've tried this, you put in an Excel spreadsheet or a table of data, and the formulas and the calculations are all wildly off. That is because AI has, up until now, treated numbers as text. It's looking at that text and using, and if you think about 1 + 1 = 2, I'm sure that appears in its training data 99.9% of the time. But if it finds an instance of, if statistically, it pulls out that last very edge use case, there is very much possibility that 1 + 1 will equal 3 or 0. Whereas in this model, what it's actually going to do is say, all right, I've got a mathematical calculation. I'm going to build myself a calculator, and I'm going to input 1 + 1, and then I'll return the value that my calculator produces. It's not going to try and do that for itself. And so that model opens up a whole lot of extra features and functionality that actually are useful. And this is where I'm going to drop out of the demo for a little bit, the slide deck for a minute, into a demo, because there's a lot of use cases here that I encourage you, if you haven't already, to explore. They are ultimately where a lot of the value comes and enables you to have a more personalized and tailored AI experience. So these, I'll leave them on screen, but I'm actually going to run through a few. So bear with me while I get that set up. Let's drop out of the slide deck. And here's my Copilot. All right. So the first one I want to walk through is custom instructions. Now, custom instructions are your way of saying, I want you to behave in this way whenever you provide me a response. You ever think about the time where you come to Copilot, you ask it to draft you an email, and it gives you something absolutely unusable because it is not how you would write. It is not the way that New Zealand business professionals would write. It's using poor grammar, or it's using US spelling. There's a lot of different things that ultimately make it unusable. Now, custom instructions allow you to change that. So I'm going to, for example, I'm going to ask for, give me a brief summary of the, let's go NZ dairy industry. It's just my go-to example. Let's go brief overview. Now I'm going to turn GPT-5 on because I always use that model. And what we're going to see is something that is, ultimately reasonably generic. And it's going to go away and do that web search. It's not going to really do anything more complex than that because it is a very basic output. Now, this might be fine. This might be exactly what I'm looking for. It might give me the information I need at a point in time. But we're going to do something a bit different. I'm going to ask Copilot, and you can do this in ChatGPT as well, by the way. If I find my way to the settings, I've got some personalization options here. Now, the way that custom instructions work is what's happening in behind the background is when I put in a prompt, it's going to add all of these points to my prompt. And so it makes it a more fuller set of instructions. These are for impact, as I'm sure you can probably tell. I'm going to ask, in this case, always end a response with a joke, always open with, of course, my leash, because that's going to stroke my ego. And then always aim, and this is a little bit more reasonable, always aim for professional brevity in your response, emphasizing readability and verbosity. Readability over verbosity. So I'll save that, and then we're going to run the same prompt again. So let's grab that same prompt, open up a new chat. And so what I encourage you to think about is, what are those things that you would give as feedback to AI if you could say what you thought about a response? Try and get those into a format that you can pass them back into those custom instructions. All right, so you can see here, Copilot has now recognized that I need a bit of recognition. It's also given me a joke at the very bottom. Why did the cow become an astronaut? Because it wanted to see the Milky Way. They're not great jokes, by the way. And we can also see that it's, in this case, it hasn't gone for too much more brevity, but compared to what we had earlier, let's go down here, I should see, yeah, the sentences are slightly shorter. So you can extrapolate that out to your own use case, and I certainly hope that you do, but it's that way of going, yeah, AI wasn't great 12 months ago, but now you have that opportunity to not train it, but allow it to learn from what your style is, right? All right. The next one I'm going to show you is memory. Memory is an interesting, is very similar. So I'm going to ask it for, let's just make sure I've got no memory in there already. Let's remove that. So memory is a different way of putting in custom instructions, but it's something you can do on the fly. So you can give it feedback as you are working through a chat. In this case, cool. It's given me a few different answers there. That's great. All right. Now I also want you, in this case, so I'm going to say add to memory to make sure that you also include yen as a currency for any monetary values. Cool. So what we should see is that the memory gets updated. So that way, and it's still got my custom instructions there from before, which I should have removed. But you can see now that if I go to a new conversation and I ask that same question, let's do that again. I'm not going to turn on GPT-5 because I probably don't need it. But what I should see is now I'm now getting currency values for yen as well as those other ones that are relevant. Cool. So we got Japanese yen in there as well. So it's just a really easy way for those little things that you always want to add those in as memory. Right. Now the next one I'm going to show you is a couple of examples around how it can work with code. So one of the cool examples that we tend to use here at KPMG is it's always a pain in the backside grabbing a process document or some sort of transcript or some long form text and turning it into a process diagram, either in Visio or Lucidchart or wherever you are, right? So what I'm going to show you here is, and I'm hoping this is going to work because the demonstration demons tend to get me when I'm trying to show this one. Here we go. Is that what I can also do is use AI to build code, and you can see in behind it that we've got some code here to actually build me some usable outputs. So here we've got an example org chart, but you imagine some other example where maybe you've been sitting in a room, you've got a transcript. This is an example I highly encourage you to use the transcript functionality of your Teams meetings or your Google Meet or whatever it is that you've got to just capture all that information as a brain dump or as a conversation. And then use that as a reference file inside of your AI tool to generate some usable outputs like this. So that's another one. I'm going to come back to this one later because it serves my demo when I'm talking about agentic AI. The next one I'm going to look at is, and this is where we use GPT-5, is I have a file of data here. Now, this is a finance example, so hopefully you can get a sense of what it means. But this here is a list of different line items in a balance sheet. So these are assets or liabilities or equity, and I've got some values there as well. Now, this might reflect some sort of data that you either get out of your systems or from someone else. It's in a raw format. It's not well understood. It's not well classified and tagged. And actually, it's really a pain to turn it into a usable output. So I'm going to take this file. If I close that one out and I go into here, and let's go and I think I've got this one here, convert this raw data into a formatted balance sheet, complete with totals and other labels or tags that would add value to a financial accountant. Now, again, extrapolate this out to your own examples. But what's going to happen here is that GPT-5, and this is unique to this model, is going to extract that file. It's going to write its own code in order to understand it and analyze it. It's going to use what AI does best and look at those names in the table and determine whether it's an asset, a liability, or equity, or something else. And then it's going to build a plan around what else I'm going to want to see in an output file. And so what we can see here is it's starting to code using Python. It'll then move to the next step. And now it's given me an answer. It's also included that memory we saw earlier. It's got a Japanese or yen conversion. Now if I find the file, I think this one here is the one we're after. Where are we? No, we haven't got the report. That's okay. Let's go regenerate downloadable file. This is where I say demonstration demons tend to come back to bite me. And while that's doing its thing, we'll do a couple of other things first. So when we start looking at agents, those very narrow specialized agents we talked about earlier, this is where I encourage you to have a think about, similar to custom instructions, what are those repeatable experiences you want to see from AI? And Researcher is one of those that comes out of the box in Copilot. You also have deep research inside of Google Gemini and Copilot. But here is an example. I can ask it to perform a long form report across a really large set of data on a particular topic. So as an example, I might ask it to, I want a broad overview of the NZ dairy industry, focusing on key processes. Actually, I'm going to do this a different way. One thing you can do, and this is something I really encourage you to do, is you can start to string together conversations with different agents. So I'm going to jump around here a little bit. I want to prepare that was bad grammar. I want to prepare a report on the various processes within the NZ dairy industry. Let me know when you're ready to begin. All right. Fire GPT-5. It's going to give me a very quick answer. I'm then going to, interesting, it's starting to reason. But what I'm going to do next is I'm going to say, all right, researcher, you're up. So similar to how you might @mention somebody in a conversation to take an action. I can @mention my agent, in this case, researcher, to then take an action. So let's look at all key processes in the NZ dairy industry at a high level, from farm to plant. All right, so research is going to go away. It's going to ask me some clarifying questions because that's not a great prompt as far as context and detail. But what we can then do is it's going to go away and do that research. Oh, in this case, it thinks there's enough. That's totally fine. It's a reasonably straightforward request. All right, now let's come back to our previous example and let's grab that Excel file. Here we go. Got our new file here. Let's open that one up. So if you remember, it was just a table with 2 columns, completely unformatted, unclassified. And if it's going to open, here we go. All right. What we should see is something that's got not only formatting, it will have totals. It has, here we go. It hasn't done the yen calculation, which is not a big deal. I didn't really want that in the first place, but what we can see here is it's given it categories, subcategories. It's retained those names, and the amounts are still there as well. It's also given me a table of notes because I thought that might be valuable. So have a think about what are those sorts of data points or formats of data that you receive that are not terribly usable in the first instance, or take a long time to use, and think about how GPT-5 or some of those later models might be able to help you with that. All right, let's see if it's the researcher has found what it needs to. Nope, still working away, but that's totally fine. What I'm going to do now is switch back to the presentation, and we're going to take a look at some of those next step things that you can do once you're past this point. And this is really where, as much as you're leveraging the different features of AI, there's also a change in thinking and mindset that I encourage you to work towards when looking at AI. Now, bear with me while I bring up the other windows. I originally had this slide as how to get tricky with AI, which is why you've got, you see the Run DMC GIF there. But one of the things I really find value from with AI is actually how do I find my gaps in knowledge? Where are my assumptions, my biases, the things that I'm missing that if I understood what they were, I'd be able to provide or produce a much more rounded and worked out response. So there's a few prompts on screen that I encourage you to read and see how you can work for yourself. So one of the things I do is if I'm working through something quite complex, I've put in all my thinking, I've gone back and forth with AI for a while, I take a pause and I think, well, what have we missed here? What are the biases that we've potentially introduced to this level of thinking? What are the assumptions I've made that may be incorrect? What are the key considerations that might change my decision or that might change our approach? And then similarly, once I've worked towards a final solution, AI is, one of the things we say is that AI is great at getting you 80% of the way there, but that last 20% should be you. But what you can do is once you have done that last 20%, give it back to your AI chat that you've been going back and forth on and say, this is the response that I produced in the end. What could we have done next time, or what prompt could we have used next time to get us closer to this response, right? So it's a really good way of going and helping you to get feedback and improve on the prompt that you would have put in originally to understand what sort of context may or may not have been missing. One of the other things you can do is before you ask your prompt, or before you finish your prompt and submit it, end your prompt with, before answering, ask me any questions that will help improve the quality of this response. Because what that does is it doesn't immediately give you a response back. It will give you a set of questions, things that will be important or may be important to your response that you maybe haven't considered. So have a think about some of those different ways that you can use AI, whether it's a feature or it's an extra prompt that you add, or just a different way of interacting more as a thought partner as opposed to transactional. Now, before I jump into the AI at home slides, which I'm going to fire through real quick, conscious of time, there's a question. In terms of memory, I sometimes struggle with AI remembering my original query. So for example, if I ask it to correct or adjust its previous answer, it keeps only considering its last response. I then reload the original info and guide it in the direction again. Any prompt tips for avoiding this? Let me think. So for example, if I ask it to correct or adjust its previous answer. Okay. So one of the things you can do is, as much as you try and direct it towards a specific response that it provided, one thing you can do, particularly over the long chats, is ask it to summarize periodically. Now, this may be a limitation on the tool that you're using. I can't speak to where it is that you're working, but asking it to periodically summarize will mean that what you may be finding is that context window, that a level of information or the amount of information that it can remember has run out, which is totally possible. So asking it to periodically summarize every few chat responses, if that's the problem that you're experiencing, is a way for it to retain at least the gist or the overview of what it has said earlier, periodically as you're going through. So that way it only has to look slightly further back up and maybe doesn't lose its memory. But yeah, and one thing I do say is if you do have specific questions like this and you're interested in connecting more, I'm more than happy to chat on LinkedIn, because it's hard to get a lot of context around some of these questions in the webinar itself. All right, now I want to spend a bit of time. I've only got 5-ish, maybe I can push it to 10 minutes left on, but I want to walk through one of the fundamental things that I encourage all of you to do, even if you don't get a lot out of what I've just talked through so far. Think about how you can use AI at home, because there are so many applications for AI around the house. These are my wife's slides. As I mentioned, she has a really good structure to the way that our life runs. We often joke to each other that we can't leave each other because we're both wrapped up in too much of our own administration. AI has definitely contributed to that, but I digress. The way we use AI at home is really to reduce the mental load. We've got 2 kids, the house is chaotic. So how do we use AI to really take away that cognitive load, to think creatively about what can we do with our kids, answer questions on the fly. We also have an Amazon Alexa. We actually just default to ChatGPT when we want to ask questions. So there's a few different areas that we use it, and these are really interesting ones, because I'm sure everyone can resonate with at least one of these things. We use it for planning our week's worth of dinners. We give it out the amount of people. We want to look for specials at our local New World, our budget. It's actually really good at going away and finding, a useful breakdown of that, what those dinners might be. It can create those recipes and then give you the ingredient list to go and find at the supermarket, right? One of my kids growing up had dairy allergies for the first few years of their life. My eldest did. And so we'd often find it very limiting to go and use recipes because we'd have to find what the substitutions were. But we can take photos of pages of recipes and say, hey, look, I'm making this recipe. What can I sub out to make it dairy-free? It's a really easy and accessible way to use AI. My wife uses it for meal prep. If we want to make something the day before, we can just rock up at home and know that everything's been prepared. She also periodically sends me messages on my phone the afternoon before I'm supposed to make dinner, giving me the recipe. She adds in a cute little joke. I try to tell her that romance is not dead, but I'm having trouble committing to that when AI is producing the cute notes. We also go through and use the dictation function. You see the little microphone there. We just talk. You give it as much of what you're thinking at a time and say, I need your help to work through this, right? So planning for a birthday, she just brain dumped everything she was thinking that she needed to work through. She then went ahead and made an invitation using ChatGPT's image generation functionality, which is awesome. Help with present planning and packing lists, and we end up taking it beyond the chat to here's the invitation that this is what ChatGPT produced. No editing from my wife. This is pure ChatGPT. My eldest is getting a bit older now, so she's able to take these sorts of images and actually pack her own bags because we're giving her visual images as opposed to a written list because she can't read yet. So have a think about what that looks like for you. What is it at home that you can do to start getting familiar and comfortable with the different ways that you can use AI? And then I've got, Jenny, I hope I can push it an extra 5 minutes because I do want to end on this piece here with a bit of a demo. But the next step for 2026 is starting to realize that GPT-5 is actually starting to look like an agentic model. It's able to do more, use more tools, create more things based on your prompt. And so having to think about those different use cases for agentic AI is really important. And you can do some of that in your own roles. So first of all, I'm going to revisit this slide here. Start thinking about how you can build or configure small-scale agents that do one thing really, really well. So thinking about that custom instruction as an example, think about how you can build a prompt and create an agent that prompts and just does that one thing really well, and then string them together. The output of one becomes the input for another, and you can start building towards an entire workflow, which I can run you through a demo of shortly. One of the applications that we're looking at is, and this is more just as a thought piece, is there are definite impacts to come to organizations using AI, and that's not a bad thing, right? My view on this is that the org charts for a lot of businesses, and this is more larger scale, we'll see it sooner, is what is traditionally a pyramid for an organization. Lots of junior people at the bottom, less at the top, at that senior layer. We're going to see that thin because AI has the potential to replace time and tasks throughout that org chart. More so at the bottom, less so at the top, but it's still prevalent everywhere, right? The challenge for businesses is actually to understand what is it that I can do to support using agents, using AI, to bring people through the organization to get to a level of seniority that means that they're comfortable working in a role where maybe there is less need for them to do that more junior and grunt work, but they still need to understand it. So can we create curated experiences with agents? Because we know in the education sector, as an example, that one-to-one, or getting as close to one-to-one student to educator is actually the most effective way to teach people. Can we recreate that in the workplace? One person gets a digital assistant or an agent. The agent does all the work fundamentally for them, but they're able to mentor that staff member through the journey of understanding and actually do it in a way that's much more streamlined. You don't have to do 100 repetitions of something just to show that you've learned it. You actually get a more curated experience so that maybe the agent's able to recognize after 20 times or 10 times, you've mastered it, let's move on. And so you potentially can streamline the way that you bring people up to a level of seniority or expertise. Now we're starting to look at that as far as workforce planning. What elements of what jobs can be replaced, augmented, or otherwise with AI. We're starting to look at that side of things as well. So I encourage you as well to start thinking about where in your roles could AI take away that cognitive load, take away that grunt work that you might not otherwise have to do, and give you time to do the things you actually want to do that maybe are innovative or creative, but ultimately bring you satisfaction and value, right? Now, Jenny, I'm conscious of time. Do I have an extra couple of minutes to run through a quick demo?
Yes, you do. Yep.
Awesome. All right. So I'm going to end on a bit of a thing that everyone, I think, who's got access to an AI tool can start thinking about doing to help to understand what agentic AI or more advanced AI solutions look like. And I'm going to run through something that I've prepared earlier rather than doing it here myself. I think because this report might still be running. So it's still running, that's okay. So what I'm going to do is I have, I believe, here we go. Okay, so this is where I've built out my own multi-agent workflow. So on the left-hand side, you'll see here, I have Researcher, which we saw earlier. I have a few others. So I've created an agent or a persona, as we sometimes call them, called Diagram Dorothy. Now, Diagram Dorothy's role is actually just to look at any text or any inputs that I give it and produce me all the process maps and process flow chart diagrams, like we saw earlier, that I need to understand that process. And so what I could do in any given chat, similar to what we did with Researcher, is I can @mention Diagram Dorothy, catching up, and Diagram Dorothy can take what has been in the chat, a bit of a lag on my end, there we go, and she can do what it is that needs to be done and recreate those diagrams. And so what I've done here is similar to what we did earlier. Let's create a PowerPoint presentation together showing some sample business processes. I've then called on Researcher, @mention Researcher, to do a deep dive into the New Zealand dairy industry. I've given it the additional context that it asked for. And then it's produced me this really long, detailed report full of citations and sources around how that industry works. So this is great. Scene setting for me, context generating for the AI, so I don't need to provide a lot of additional information. It's all already here. And then once that's been done, I've gone, all right, Diagram Dorothy, extract and display all processes mentioned. So you can see here, Diagram Dorothy is now taking the next action. So what she's done, and it's not perfect at this stage, she's gone and written some Mermaid code, like we saw earlier, to create as many process flow diagrams as she could identify I needed from that previous report. Now, all of this information came from that researcher agent. So researcher agent provided the context. Diagram Dorothy has now come along and produced all of the process flow diagrams for that. I asked it to do a bit of troubleshooting, and I managed to fix a few of them as well. Carry on there. And then at the very end here, I'm going to export that to PowerPoint, so I get all those diagrams in a file. And then as a Word file as well. And then I've got a different agent, Email Eddie. Now, Email Eddie writes emails in my style. I've asked Copilot to create me a style guide based on all my emails, so it knows how I write, knows the common keywords that I use, it knows how I sign off. And so I've asked Email Eddie, similar to before, @mention Email Eddie. So write an update to my boss on the progress of this work. So Callan's my boss. He knows that I end my email in cheers generally. I often outline what my next steps are, but it's kept it relatively brief, and that's in language that I would use. So that's that's something that I can then go and copy and paste into an actual email and send. Now, depending on your use case, those agents will probably look different. There's some that I definitely encourage you to have. An email agent that writes in your style is also an awesome one to start off with, because it's accessible and easy to understand. But think about, again, what are those different things that you do repeatedly, and where might you think about an agent as a specialist or someone to delegate to, right? As a final example, I have Critical Carl. Critical Carl is where I start getting into that thought partnering piece. And I bring in Critical Carl whenever I'm doing a long piece of work to help me understand those biases, those assumptions and constraints that I might not have thought about. So he's quite a valuable agent as well. So hopefully that gave you enough to take away and to start thinking about AI in more than just that very, very baseline way. And you can find some application for it in your own roles. Now, I believe we've got a bit of time for questions now, so I'm happy to answer any that anyone's got.
Thank you, Morgan. That was a very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. So for all of our members who are online, as Morgan has just said, if you do have any questions, can you please pop those into the Q&A box? We'll just give you a minute or so to see if anything comes through, and Morgan can answer those for you. Okay, Morgan, it doesn't look like we have any questions coming through, but thank you so much for your time today and for such a fantastic presentation. I know we all really enjoyed that. So to all of our members, if you'd like to revisit this webinar, it will be available on the Training on Demand section of the Survey and Spatial website. And if any questions come out of that after you've re-watched the link, please send those questions through to me, and I'm sure that Morgan would be happy to answer those. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us today, and I hope you all have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.